Given your history with so much traveling and seeing so many gyms and trying out so much equipment and owning a gym yourself, I wanted to ask you about some underrated and slash favorite exercises of yours that, things that you've tried and things that you've liked, because I think that is something that you have a lot of experience with. Maybe just going through a couple of the major muscle groups, like
Sure,
for the
sure.
chest.
Okay, so well, I think that getting really strong on several different angles of dumbbell pressing, that's an excellent exercise.
Mm,
Yeah, anyone that can dumbbell press the 150s with proper form, like good form and good range for sets of 10, they all have chests. Dumbbell presses are awesome. The range is better. The angle on your shoulders and elbows is better than with a barbell. I can't even do barbell presses anymore because my elbows and wrists just don't want to line up like that. But I
mm,
can dumbbell press, no problem. Yeah, I think dumbbell presses are awesome for chest, and guys should use them as like a progressive exercise. I remember when I really got serious about dips, I remember feeling like dips changed my body,
mm.
like my triceps and my chest. And I remember it's because a friend of mine was telling me, he's like, look at all the Olympic gymnasts that work on the pommel horse. They all have big horseshoe triceps and they all have big pecs, and none of them do tricep extensions. And none of them are doing like, cable crossovers, you
Yeah.
know, and just how the dip was like, I remember listening to a guy talk about how the dip was like a supernatural position. That's how we get up on stuff. It's like a climbing position. It's very, very, very like functional. There's a lot of muscle working. It's like he was comparing it like, he was saying, people say squat, bench, chin up or whatever, squat, bench, deadlift, chin up. The dip should be listed, right?
Mm.
And so I remember when I got real serious about dips, strapping on like 245s, 345s, stuff like that. I remember thinking like, it's not often you think a specific exercise makes an impact on your physique, but I remember thinking that.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's the awesome thing about like chatting with you is you have all these years to like look back and all the things you've tried, right?
Right.
How
Thanks.
about how about the back? You said always searching for the perfect row.
One of the unfortunate things was I came from that era where everybody got too caught up in the Dorian Yates style bent over row and trying to use a shit ton of weight on it.
Mm,
And, it might have even looked like they were pretty strict, but there just wasn't any control there. And there just wasn't any real serious, like, quality range and, that sort of stuff. And I remember when I sort of finally like gave in and started like trying to bend over a lot farther and changed my bent row and all that stuff. I remember that's when my back, like, I remember because that carried over to a lot of other exercises, right? Just how I altered my rowing form.
mm,
And I remember like it worked for him, obviously, but he also did pullovers and he also did, those underhand hammer strength pull downs, which are an awesome exercise.
mm,
And he also, deadlifted, and so his back was awesome because of a lot of reasons. But the Yates row became like kind of like it was like a crazy like phenomenon that everyone needed to do because we thought it was going to give us a back like Dorian. But and I eventually kind of gave up on that row. That's when my back really like got better.
mm,
And I always had a wide back structurally. I always had a good wide lat spread, but thickness all through the back double bicep was always something because I'm such a big guy. I just needed more of it. My back got a lot thicker as I started like leaning into my rows more.
mm,
You know what I mean? Instead of, always arching back and leaning into my rows more. I remember that was a huge change in just how
hmm.
I felt about back training. And I felt like also too, I wish it would have came earlier because I would have had a better back.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like with a bent row, it's a very fundamental aspect to like it's a very fundamental movement pattern. So like yeah, figuring out those technique adaptations will apply to a lot of other pulling movements as well.
Yeah, yeah.
How about the
Um,
shoulders?
I remember in like 95, I was training with a guy in Australia named John Davey. Everyone in Australia knows him. We would do in the old school military chair that was like straight up and down. They didn't have any safety rack around it at all, just had like the rack behind.
Okay.
And we would get in that, and he would go up to 4 plates aside behind the neck. And I remember the bar would come down and like
Oof.
kind of bump him in the head on every rep. And he would go up to 4 plates. And I remember I was like 19, And I just felt lucky to train with this guy because he was like the guy at that gym. Like everyone's like, oh, that's the guy that's going to turn, that's the big freak, right? So I was training with him and I got to spot him on that. And I just think, like, man, every time he did that, I was super nervous to spot him because just that, how kamikaze a behind the neck press is to begin with. And then it's like dead straight chair and there's no rack. And it was just that's whenever I think of shoulder training and like the craziest things I ever saw, that was like spotting him on those was always scared me. Behind the neck press never did anything for me. We were all dumbbell pressing with our elbows too far back. That's one thing I did my whole life. I look back at, like, I even have some old videos of me dumbbell pressing like 130s, like just cranking them out. But my elbows are like all the way back. And I just think of how, that probably wasn't good for my shoulders. And, now when I shoulder press, I've got my elbows in more and I feel it way more in my delts. And there was a couple things that we did because we just didn't know they were wrong. No one was walking around telling us anything about that. It was like we actually thought it was better, keep them straight, that sort of thing. So yeah, like shoulder training changed over the years because, of that kind of old school stuff was there when I started, like the behind the neck press and stuff like that. I think that the main thing for people is I know it's broken record stuff, but people don't know how to do side laterals. They really have a hard time with them. A lot of people have a real hard time. And I tell people just to stand in a doorway and push out with their hands and like just push the back of their wrists against the door frame and just practice that. And that's all they have to do. And it sometimes like helps them. But yeah, everyone turns their arms back and lifts their hands way farther than their elbows and all that stuff. The side laterals, man, that's a key to, if you want big delts, like big round shoulders, you have to learn how to do lateral raises. Like then you have like, a bunch of options to do them. And single arm cables are probably my favorite side lateral. The most tension, you can do them, you know what I mean? You could step away, get a different strength curve, step closer, get a different strength curve. You can move around. They're really, really versatile. Sometimes you can raise the pulley up a few holes, so it's like coming straight out across, it changes where the heaviest point is. It'll be heaviest at the bottom. So you can do all sorts of stuff with a single arm cable side lateral. It's like that's really all you need for side raises if you had to pick one.
Yeah, that's a good point about the cable height because like when your arm is all the way down, if you're thinking about the force vector, you want it to be like perpendicular to where you're pulling.
Yeah, I mean, you can make them so they're heaviest at the top or heaviest at the bottom. You could do all that stuff.
And then some other big muscle groups, quads.
I'm convinced that foot placement has way less importance than depth. If you look at all the Olympic athletes that have big quads, you have to find cues. You have to find like clues in other athletes. So look at sprint cyclists versus long distance cyclists, right? Their quads are completely different. Obviously, they're training to be explosive. So they're in the weight room doing stuff. But the point is their knee comes to their chest on every stroke, full knee flexion almost on every, you know what I mean? Major knee flexion, huge power. Okay, well now Olympic lifters, well, they wear, with those heeled shoes. So they're actually more quad dominant in that crazy front squat that they do, right? When they do the clean and jerk, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So hey, look at their quads. They all have big round quads and quad sweeps and thick teardrops, short track speed skaters have really muscular legs and they have very deep knee flexion on all the strokes. And then if you look at like volleyball players, they don't have big quads. They kind of jump from halfway up all the time. Most of their jumps aren't from ass to grass. So I don't know. I sort of think that the depth is a big factor for quad sweep and activation. And I think the teardrop muscle seems to activate the most out of the deep stretch and the full contraction. And also the quad sweep kind of does too, if you think about it, because they don't stretch that much. They're only single joint muscles. The rectus femoris down the middle, that's a 2-joint muscle. So it's got a lot more going on through it. And if we think about big quads for bodybuilders, it's the teardrop and the sweep that sometimes lack development. And that's what gives the illusion of the crazy leg, right? Is a teardrop and the sweep. And I think that that's full range. I think people have to get their ass down, like full knee flexion, get deep if you want big quads. I think that's the key. The bullshit leg pressing that we did for so many years, you know what I mean? I mean, we were going to 90 degrees. Don't get me wrong. There's tons of overload there, but the risk is just so high. At the end of the day, it's about overload. So if you want to sacrifice some range of motion for 5 more plates aside, you're still going to get massive stimulus. So you could still get huge legs. Like, look at all the guys like with massive legs that had kind of shitty range, but they just got so strong that the overload was just too much and the legs got huge. I'm saying that when you choose that route, your risks are a lot higher.
Yeah.
So I think that the fuller range you use, the more efficient you will be with your quad training. So hack squats, sink them, leg press, learn how to be quad dominant on a leg press, put your feet lower on the platform, get your ankle flexion to improve, stretch the shit out of your calves. If you don't have good ankle flexion, it's hard to get good quads.
Yeah, that's a good point about how it's the trade-off between fatigue and then risk of injury with the stimulus you're getting. It's kind of the stimulus to fatigue ratio where as you become more advanced, especially if you're strong, that like and with big movements like squats, it's a huge or heavy leg presses like that. You're talking about lots and lots of weight that you can actually move if you sacrifice some range of motion.
Yeah, crazy. 15 plates aside for like, when you see guys like, I remember doing that. I remember doing 15 plates aside,
Mm.
Knee wraps on, getting like to at least 90 degrees. So like pretty good range for that type of weight, and cranking out like, working sets with that. And we'd go to failure. We'd have to have a guy spotting us, like 2 guys spotting us for the set. Like we'd call 2 guys over. Okay, it's work set time. And everyone's like, come on, and there's 2 guys spotting you to get a forced rep with 15 plates aside. Like, talk about like risk to reward benefit being like probably really, really low. You know what I mean? But those were the reps. But those also like, I could also go into how that's like mentally makes you better and tougher too to do that. But that's another conversation, I guess.
And then hamstrings.
Stiff leg deadlifts. I am pretty convinced that stiff leg deadlifts are fundamental to having really thick hamstrings, that loaded stretch. I just can't get away from the fact that we have quite a bit of research about stretch loading muscle and hypertrophy. Like, I remember not doing dumbbell flies for a while because of a shoulder issue, and then putting dumbbell flies back in, and my pecs looked better. And that's a huge stretch load exercise. So I think stretch loading exercises are great. Overhead tricep extensions, stuff like that. So with the hamstrings, that's why I think the stiff leg deadlift is so fundamental and important. If I had to pick one more exercise for hams, all you really need, seated leg curls. They're both effectively stretch loading exercises, but if you do those 2 things, that's, I think, probably, if you could only pick 2, that'd be it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting hearing your picks and how like you still come back to basics, the basics, basic heavy compounds.
Well, when my hamstrings, one of the things I had, like, my physique had many issues, but one of the things I had was I had really good hamstring drop from the side, and I had really ripped hamstrings from the back. So there's this, hamstrings were one of the things that I had. And I remember every time I got stronger on stiff leg deadlifts, I thought my hamstrings got better. I wound up doing stiff leg deadlifts with like 500 pounds for reps, by the time I was at my biggest. And they were good form too, like, mid shin, flat back, sticking your ass out, dropping down on your heels, kind of, you know what I mean? Real hamstring torque deadlifts. As stronger I got on those, the bigger my legs got from the back, How
about for arms?
Man, arms that was for me. Biggest I ever got my arms was 21 3/4 cold. I never measured them fully pumped. I regret that. But I was at a body weight of like 330. So that really wasn't that big of an arm from how big I was. I always was struggling to get bigger arms. It's funny, like the 2 things that I kind of like had to struggle with were arms and calves. And those are the body parts that I wound up training with the most frequency and the most volume. Tried everything else. There's nothing left to do but just add sets until they grow. Like, what's this going to take? Because I had already done like as intensive as of working sets as you could possibly do, and just struggling to get them to adapt. So I just started training them more with more frequently with more sets, and And that's when I got them to their biggest. I had an arm day, and then I also did like 4 really hard high rep sets of tris on chest day, and 4 really hard high rep sets of biceps on back day. Then I would occasionally do another like random superset during the week where I just superset bis and tris for like 3 sets of 20 or something. Start to get feedback from the people you train with, right? They're like, your arms are bigger. You're like, are they? Because you're scared to measure them. You measure them for like 3 years and they're the same size, you know? So, and then, but I remember that's when I got my arms the biggest. So I just say, man, some body parts, I don't know. What do you got to do?
And then for calves, I presume, something similar.
Same thing. Calves are so simple, right? I'm relatively like, straight leg exercises, focus on those actually, because I think if you have to only do one, you do the straight leg stuff, because the seated is more soleus based, which I never really had a problem with. So I did calves 3 times a week, for a while there. And that's when I got them to, the biggest my calves ever got was 21, but I never had great calves shape wise. Like I didn't have beautiful calves, those sharp corners and stuff. Mm-hmm. Mine were sort of more rounded and stuff. And so I never had like crazy calves, but I got them up to 21 at one point. But to get them to 21, I was training them 3 times a week, partial reps on every set, like burn the shit out of them, just like annihilation stuff, where I'm going to do like, I'm going to do 4 sets of 20, but it's really only the first set where I get 20 real reps. And then the second set's like 15 plus 5 partials, and then 10 plus 10 partials, and then like 8 plus 12 partials. Like those are the sets I do. Like just burn the crap out of them. That was just my all or nothing approach, my desperate nuke everything type of attitude to try to get them to grow.